Hi, everybody. Welcome. Thanks so much for joining us here today. My name is Lydia Webster. I'm the Assistant Curator at the Center for the Arts and Religion at the Graduate Theological Union here in Berkeley. And I am delighted to welcome you all to this lunchtime of poetry together with poets Sarah Gridley and Nate Klug. Before we get started and I pass over to our two poets, I just want to quickly let you know a little bit more about what we do at CARE and how you can get involved with us in other ways. There are two of us on staff here at CARE, myself and Dr. Elizabeth Pena, and we offer 2 art exhibitions per semester online for right now, events also online, courses and workshops in the arts and religion, and we also offer grants for GTU students and faculty. So if you do want to learn more about CARE, I'll put the links to learn more about us in the chat box in just a second. So thank you again to everybody for being here with us. And thank you very much indeed to Nate and Sarah for being our poets today. So I will pass it over to you two now. Thank you very much.
Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for joining. It's good to see you all here. My name is Nate Klug, and I am an adjunct professor at Graduate Theological Union through CARE. And for the last 5 years or so, I've had the honor of offering something to help us celebrate National Poetry Month during the month of April. And I'm especially excited about what we have to offer this year. We're really, really lucky to have poet Sarah Gridley joining us. Sarah is the author of 4 collections of poetry. I read her most recent, a friend of mine recommended her most recent book called Insofar during the pandemic, and it really blew me away. And so what we're going to do is Sarah and I are going to talk a little bit. We're going to use this lens of poems and questions as our sort of jumping off point, and we might go in all sorts of directions, I think. And Sarah's also going to read for us. She's going to read a sort of few poems at a time, and then we'll talk a little bit, then we'll hear some more poems, and then have a little more conversation. And we are an intimate but mighty group, and so we hope that other folks can chime in either through the chat or I'll leave some time for questions as well. So yeah, we come together on this really meaningful week, I think, in the middle of the season of Ramadan. Passover starts tonight. Good Friday is also today. And so lots of meaning in the air. And I thought as a way of just setting the tone, we would just hear some words from the poet Rainer Maria Rilke, who has this wonderful passage in one of his letters to a young poet, where he talks about engaging with the questions of life. So I'll just read that for us, and then I'll invite Sarah into some conversation. So this is Rilke writing to a younger poet. You are so young, you stand before beginnings. I would like to beg of you, dear friend, as well as I can, to have patience with everything that remains unsolved in your heart. Try to love the questions themselves, like locked rooms and like books written in a foreign language. Do not now look for the answers. They cannot now be given to you because you could not live them. It is a question of experiencing everything. At present, you need to live the question. And so Sarah, welcome. We're so glad to have you.
Thanks.
And, just in the spirit of Rilke's advice, I wondered if you might just start by talking to us a little bit about your journey with regards to poetry and divinity school. One of the things I learned about you was that relatively recently you'd moved from being a professor of poetry and creative writing to now studying religion and theology. So yeah, talk to us about that decision and how poetry might have fit into that.
Yes, I left my job of 13 years teaching at Case Western Reserve University here in Cleveland. And there are a number of reasons why I did, but I think they all come down to the fact that I wanted to pursue questions that had led me to poetry in the first place, and that poetry had been a place to engage those questions, and it still is, but I wanted to engage them in a formal, scholarly way. And so that's when I decided to apply for this. It's a master's in theology and religious studies at a local Jesuit university. And that also coincides with a desire to be more in the world and less in academia. And being more in the world, I hope, will mean that I will start a clinical pastoral education program this fall and then move into doing chaplaincy work in a hospital setting. And I think poetry was, I guess, a way to engage questions that that had always felt vitally important to me. Dylan Thomas was a really early influence. And if you're familiar with his poem, Fern Hill, there's a line in there where he says that the Sabbath rang slowly in the pebbles of the holy streams. And my dad is from Wales, and he introduced me to Dylan Thomas very early on. And that line, I had no idea what it meant, but it really captured my imagination. And I feel like poetry is my way into communing with the natural world and living the questions that the natural world presents to me. I would describe myself theologically as a panentheist, which is a word that Sally McFaig taught me in her book, The Body of God and Ecological Theology. So I'll stop there. And if you are wanting more on that question, I can go on. But
No, that's so interesting, and I think it has lots of connections to some of the folks who are with us today on the Zoom. I'm curious because, so, I went to divinity school kind of right after I got really into poetry in college. And I had this weird feeling like I would have to choose at some point. I was going to have to choose if I really wanted to be like a professional religious person or a poet. And fortunately, I haven't had to choose yet. But I wonder if, in your journey and your discernment, if you've ever felt like a tension, or has poetry always been a sort of doorway to the divine?
I think if I feel a tension, it's a very productive one. And I guess it's the old tension between maybe listening and saying is the easiest way to put it, being receptive and being emotive. And maybe another way to think about that is the relationship between language and silence. So yeah, I think that's a very productive tension for me. And I'm really interested, particularly in the Rilke quote, in what he says about not being able to live the answers. And I was reflecting on that and thinking, what about answers is somehow inhospitable to vivacity or life, living and liveliness. And I think, poetry, I used to tell my students that you may start a beginner and then reach intermediate, but you never leave intermediate as a poet. I still consider myself an intermediate poet in every sense, because you always start again with a blank page. And it's never become easy for me to trust what I'm saying is true and kind and necessary, and all of those things that, you know, we sort of want to be the case when we're using language. So I think it's a very productive tension. I was thinking also in living the questions, the great thing about returning to school and in this theological and religious studies context is re-encountering scripture and questions about scripture and questions about revelation. And, you know, there are these texts that we think we're familiar with, or I'll say for myself, I think I'm familiar with Genesis, but Genesis just becomes stranger and stranger to me the more I spend time with it. And I think the strangest part of Genesis for me right now is the question where God is walking in the garden. This is after they've eaten the fruit, and God says, "Where are you?" And that question is such an interesting question, because does God know the answer to that and finds it necessary to pose the question? Does God not know the answer to that? In which case, we're not talking about an omniscient God. You know, there's this sort of sense of intimacy and also obviously estrangement or distance. Where are you? But, you know, to imagine yourself hiding in the trees, having just eaten this fruit and being called to answer for yourself, it's a really strange moment. And, you know, what it says to me and what creation itself says to me is that the source of being is seeking relationship and seeking accountability and seeking response. And so I think poetry is a way to, at its best, engage that question, where are you? And I think, you know, I don't know about you, but I've been listening to the spring birds and enjoying the spring birds. And I remember learning from somebody who knows about birds that they have something called a check call, which is not a mating call. It's just what it sounds like. It's a check call. I'm over here. Where are you? And then the other bird answers, I'm over here. Where are you? So, you know, that sort of spatial relationship and call and response feels very much part of what drives poetry for me.
That's so great. I think we should hear some poems. I have some more things I want to respond to, but I'd love to hear some of your poems now, Sarah. So maybe I'll share the screen.
Sure, yeah.
You can read that first group.
Yeah.
Okay.
So this is the poem that takes its cue from something Rilke says in, I think it's the third elegy, and he's referencing the book of Tobit. Where are the days of Tobias, when one of you, veiling his radiance, stood at the front door, slightly disguised for the journey, no longer appalling? Where are the days of Tobias? The fresco cracks cooperatively over time, not to give a secret away, but gradually to break off keeping it. In the sky, you make birds like this, one wing longer than the other, an asymmetrical V wedged against wind, one stroke longer than another. Never the bodies turn the same direction, each finding its own angle, and one in the distance, a dot. These are the deadly birds of the soul Rilke was forced to call terrifying, migratory, weighing no more than a pencil. Because every flying thing is passionate, and every flight a posture torn from stone. There was a time it was a theme parents would pay an artist to realize, the face of a beloved son, a Luca or Piero, painted onto the shoulders of Tobias, painted into the company of Raphael. you tell yourselves and your quiet house, no harm will come to the boy as he goes out. A guardian, though, is not a guard. To keep safe is subtly different from confining. Radiance can strategically direct itself to seem like us, ready as it were to walk. As a mirror goes through the appearance of requiring subsistence, goes through the motions of a meal whose food appears to be food. Radiance, we know, is never quite as warm as light. Who has not tasted the silver in sea mist? Whosever they are, angels are the first to surface there. You know a guardian by the silver of a river crossing, of a father's filmy eyes, in gall, heart, fire, and mostly smoke, in smoke and mostly mirror. As wedged between forward and backward being, rehashing and planning ahead, presence will be specced again with being erased. A reusable writing surface calling down to the life without rest, the self-propelled surveillances of sharks. Analog. This is a poem for Roy Wright, who is the artist who drew this sweet chestnut fruit. I was low, so I reached for your pencil drawing of the sweet chestnut fruit, the infinitely spiky female cupule, to think what monkish discipline makes a drawing so taxing and soft. As rays bear with the sun, as each spoke holds with the wheel, you seem to have suffered the chestnut as the shy host might a desired guest. Comedy. You've been given your coat, sewn with a coda. Late for morning, early for evening, the generalities are coming down in laxly sundered specks. What little magic might spread over us is here. A sniff, a blink, a slow indexical trail telling across the hall table. Those coming, those going, the dry, tickling, stuffy taste, a close to weightless song of matter layering itself to rest. The same, the sorry, the everywhere falling, light and steady, heavy and delayed, while you'll kiss the very picture of it, face and glass amassing days of it, motes and motes, loose as you please, dry as a sifting snowfall, never made of water, but soft, cut from the same cloth, of a body width. I think we're near, we're almost there, but see how much this stuff is like our leaving out all thought of us. Only touch the sleeve, the seam, dander, pollen, daydream. It's good, the dream, I think. I think it has to be.
Sarah, thanks for those. So we'll hear some more poems in a minute, but I wanted to ask a question or two now. And if anybody else has a question, please go ahead and enter them into the chat. Okay, so this is going to be hard to put, but going back to Genesis and what you said about the book of Genesis, as you were talking about that and as you were reading, I was reminded of this quote from Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the German theologian. And I don't know if you know I think he wrote a whole commentary on Genesis. And he says something, you might know it better than me, but he says he's interested in the fact that the tree is in the middle of the garden. And he kind of extrapolates from that to really suggests that, what the scripture is suggesting is that there's this kind of big question mark or big ambiguity, right in the middle of our lives, right? That can be used for good and evil. And I've just always thought, it's such a powerful existential kind of metaphor, that this question that's a tree in the middle of our lives. And I get something like that in, so often in reading your poems. I'm so struck by the way they arrive at these abstractions, like here, what little magic might spread over us. In the Tobias poem, presence will be specked again with being erased. And, those aren't questions per se, but they have that kind of quality. And I'm just kind of curious how those abstractions kind of arrive for you in your writing process. And maybe it's different every time, but do you begin with those? Do you feel like more often you sort of write yourself into those?
That's a really interesting question. My first instinct is to say that I write myself into those, and that I'm interested in the place where perceptual data accrues to the point that you reach for abstraction. And I think I'm really parsing Joy Graham here. So this is not an idea that is original to me, but this idea, she has a really wonderful essay on silence, and it may be there, maybe somewhere else, where she talks about the relationship between the perceptual and the conceptual. I've also always thought about the relationship between the concrete and the abstract, and that they are in a wonderfully dialectical relationship with each other, and that the concrete grounds the speculative, and the speculative keeps us from like calcification, like where the concrete sort of takes hold so strongly that there's no room to kind of move or see beyond it. So I think that's a really animating tension in the poem between the concrete and the abstract. I think of the abstract as the speculative. Yeah. And I think, I'm now anticipating one of the poems that's coming, which is called Radius, but I think of the radius. I love circles and radii, or the thought of a radius as something that is the kind of inaugurating motion of the circle. And I'm definitely influenced by Emerson, and believe in his idea that every circle just waits for another circle to be drawn. And I think the radius is the way into that next circle. So maybe what I'm really talking about is spirals, not circles. But the radius itself is a kind of concrete thing. It's an inscription, it's a manifestation, but it's also indicative of a kind of further circle, or smaller, larger or smaller circle. So I think, geometry is interesting because it sits right in between the concrete and the abstract. And I think that's the only math I ever loved doing, was geometry for that reason, because it had that kind of, there were shapes and there were things that could kind of anchor these ideas.
Yeah. Yeah, and it has old ancient links with theology, I think, in multiple traditions.
Yeah.
Well, let's keep going, because I think the next group of poems contains that poem Radius, and also a few poems called Insofar, which kind of relate maybe geometrically or logically as well to what we're talking about. So maybe we'll hear the next four now.
Sure. do no harm. As if the bird were not in one room, but many, and making the sound of many seabirds pinning dunes to blue and vibrant yards of wind. That sanding down was why, was surely what I felt the credo was. No mean or desperate motion, no graceless tangling in the rafters, but light as fire to an open flue, the relic beehive feathering up to ashes in the draft. This was where I told myself to live, and pressed my life to going over everything I did. Insofar as you are forewarned, they say you are forearmed. I'd like to remember what a warning is, how it slips through caution into notice, how it slips through creation as creation's second condition. 1 centimeter in 100 days. The health of a nail is evident in the moon-shaped matrix of cells where some have said a human's fate begins. A nail moves out from under its cuticle. I see what is noticed is only sometimes what is known. Little moons, lunulae. I try to remember what the remotest human was. Insofar as the golden larch grows out another spring, insofar as the needles look gold or copper with the close of the growing season and fall like the milk teeth of a mammal, deciduous, insofar as deciduous is what falls down or off, really what is cut off, insofar as a thing can be cut off from its other extraneous, as in the making of decisions, as in the feeling of this being severed from an adjacent feeling for that, as if these feelings had not a common vertex and a common side, insofar as the tree you have in mind is both coniferous and deciduous. Could it not be turning a color darkly adjacent to green, insofar as coniferous is cone-bearing, but not also evergreen in every case, insofar as a golden larch is real, and real is then the feeling of those cones shaped like small artichokes in a mast season, when they boss the golden larch like pieces of ornamental carving covering the point where the ribs in a vault or ceiling cross, insofar as architecture might be analogous to arboriculture, or until a wind or creature should detach a cone, which will easily detach insofar as it is a golden, not a true larch, and once detached, will cast its long-winged seeds to life, insofar as life is there to catch them, to heave and bury them, insofar as actions are decisions as to what is or is not continuous. Radius. Around every circle, another can be drawn. You pointed out a woodenness, coaxed its rows to wandering, made every door real with refusal, sly with admission. I have seen you lighting on the landscaped mirror. Your oil looks functional down to the burning pond. There's a murmur, a pearl to your single-most discipline. You burden like a mess I haven't finished making. Like starlings, you are drawing all the starlings from the sky.
Thanks, Sarah. Those are beautiful. So the book Insofar is right here. It's a really beautiful a lot more space in the layout than most
Yeah.
contemporary poetry books. And, one of the things that I think the reader notices right away is the title Insofar, and then the book is organized. The titles are alphabetical. Is there a term for that? Do you have a term for that?
Well, what is the name for the poems where you write the flush left is alphabetical? It's a ABC.
Abecedarian or
There
something.
you go. I
Yeah.
can never pronounce it, but yeah, I'm not sure if that applies to the whole
Right.
to a whole book, but it's sort of,
It's in the mix there. Yeah. And then there are 4 poems that are called Insofar.
Yeah.
And so we just heard 2 of them. And I just wonder if you might talk about that word a little bit, and maybe relating it back to some of what we were talking about before in terms of geometry or not. But it's in some ways such an unpoetic word to me.
Yeah.
And you use it so differently in the 2 poems. But it obviously possesses a lot of, it's obviously very generative for you. So yeah, talk about that word.
Yeah. So when I hear that word, and with the word as, insofar as, is adverbial. It controls the conditions of the way a verb might act, I guess is the way to put it. So it feels very conditional to me. It feels dispositional to me. It also, I don't know why I get this sort of tactile and visual image of a rubber band stretching, and we've all probably stretched a rubber band too far to the point where it snaps. But insofar seems to hold 2 things in relationship. And in order for this to be true, this has to meet these conditions. So it's not a form of truth seeking that is one-sided. It's a form of truth seeking that feels accountable to new information and always kind of tenuous. And so it really appealed to me as I guess a form of epistemology is the way to put it, a way of knowing, or as with the Rilke quote, have asked us to think about living the questions, insofar as is a great exercise for living the questions, because it feels kind of like it's always, just as in this Golden Larch poem, just keeps opening new questions of relationship. And when I was teaching, I like what you say about it being a not very exciting word or not glamorous word, or I can't remember.
Yeah, not poetic.
Not poetic, kind of a dull word. I think I had been reading the philosopher, is it Austin? I'm not remembering his first initials. But he was an ordinary language philosopher, and I think the book is Doing Things with Words, or that's not the right title. Maybe someone can supply the right title, but
I think it's J.L. Austin, right?
J.L. Austin, yeah. And which is kind of a dull book. I remember really slogging through it, but also really loving it, because he does spotlight, oh, there we go, how to do things with words. Thank you. So he spotlights what I would call sort of trudging words or workhorse words. And when I was teaching, I used to do this as a writing exercise. I gathered together this type of language, like nevertheless, or insofar as, or, you can think of your own list of words that kind of they almost don't show up in a sentence because they're doing the structuring of the sentence. So they almost sort of disappear into the logic of the sentence. But once I started noticing this phrase insofar as, because I read a lot of philosophy, it seemed to just show up everywhere. And it seemed to be a way of driving inquiry and a way of kind of holding relationships in consideration. So, and then it also reminded me, just if you kind of go blurry on it a little bit, it kind of reminded me of Innisfree, you know, which is one of my favorite, the Lake Isle of Innisfree. It almost feels like a place. And I, as you'll see in my poem, Far Out, there's something about that word far that really appeals to me. So
I love thinking of it as a place. Yeah. And the epistemology that it implies, you know, it's almost like it's the opposite of absolute truth statements or something, because you're always being relational. You're always kind of implying a context to whatever the be part of the sentence is. And then, you know, often you don't actually have a final part of the sentence, right? I mean, that right. Seems like it's part of how your poems are working in this mode. Yeah, so I have one more question at this point that I'd love to hear you talk about, and maybe it connects to what we're saying, but so in terms of this sort of provisionality, you know, wanting to be, I guess, epistemologically humble, and also moving from observation to speculation. You know, one thing that strikes me about this book is how unconfessional it is, how unautobiographical perhaps. I mean, I would say it's very personal, but it's not, you know, it's not poems that necessarily give us a ton about, you know, what happened to the speaker in, you know, the most recent years of their life. And in that way, it's distinctive distinctive from quite a bit of contemporary poetry. It's part of what makes it appealing to me. And I just wonder if I could push you a little further on. You actually seem to, in some of the poems, you seem to, how can I say this? There seems to be a almost like a wish for dissolution or kind of moving out from the self into the world in, you know, kind of an extreme way. I think you have this epigraph, which I just wanted to read. Then for a breath, there was no sign of us, not a soul, only light flooding this field, bright as a marigold. One of my favorite quotes in all of literature is from Willa Cather. And she says that happiness is to be dissolved into something complete and great. And I don't know, I just wonder if you can talk about that. Maybe I'm missing something, but this, if it's there in your work, this sort of wish for dissolution and how that might be part of your spirituality.
That's a great question. So I first just want to say that quote the lovely marigold quote you just read is by my friend Jeremy Hooker, who's a poet who lives just outside of Cardiff in Wales, whom I've had the good fortune to be in correspondence with and even meet at his home there. And I really recommend his work to anyone who's not read him before. Jeremy Hooker, he's a great poet and also essayist. But to this question of dissolution, I was laughing because I started swimming during the pandemic as a form of exercise, as a form of meditation, I would say too. And I said to a friend, we were having coffee, and I said that swimming is really marvelous to me because I almost feel like I could dissolve. If I swam long enough, that I might just dissolve into the water. And I was thinking of I grew up, or I was born in 1968, and I grew up during the era of the Alka-Seltzer plop plop fizz fizz commercials, and I said to this friend, I almost feel like an Alka-Seltzer tablet that could dissolve in water. So you're a very keen reader of my work, because that's an actual desire that I recently voiced out loud. And I'm not really sure. I think the question about spirituality is very interesting. The poems I'll finish out with are from this new book called Even So, which is another one of those, not very exciting phrases. I'm sticking with this, like the dull phrases that seem to yield interesting pursuits. But this new book is all about water. And I was really interested to learn the difference between, to be fearful of water, aquaphobia is one thing, and to be fearful of deep bodies of water, thalassophobia, is another thing. And I think because I grew up when Jaws came out in paperback, I have forever been terrified of deep water because of that image of the shark coming up from below the swimmer. But I'm also very much drawn to deep water. And I think for me, water, I think my spirituality is very elemental. I was thinking about this just, in this sort of spring season of high winds and, kind of variable rains, and having my windows open, having the fire of the sun kind of warming. I really think elementally about spirituality. And I think more and more as I get older, I'm drawn to, I think as a young person, I was very drawn to fire. And I think now I'm very drawn to water, especially. And, I'm sure that we could sort of go in a sacramental direction with that. And it's funny, I was baptized in brackish water, in pond water that connected with the ocean. And I think I'm really interested in the difference between fresh water and salt water, and the way they can sometimes communicate.
Thanks for that. Should we hear the last group?
Sure.
Then we'll maybe talk a little bit more to wrap up.
Addressee. I mind less that you go far away in time. Once I had to harden myself to the idea. Now I ask more of it, and you, and the carryover. Those I find time for presently do not bring this cup of stars your listening makes. Few of us are free of petty necessity, hurts spun back to inflictions, ambition rocking to exhausted desire. I worry less that I'm not into this. I love the curtain between us, the old space of sailing, the birds that fly so far from land. One. Had you been a pond, we might have known you better. As you opened your eye in the thick of us, we could never have made our way around you. Where there was no consensus in the popular sense, even less consensus in a plausible sense, thoughts came up with bees and stones and pushed on doors to nourishing darks. It was the cool and singular sanctuary conscience possibly is. It was a place to go and look inside of, not prepared to be found or said as a whole. As moons came variously before us, as stipulations flew with bits of straw, was it a strategy time or some luminous negligence? One had only to see how umbles arrived, the spokes and turns of their summer wheels. One had only to feel the stoical so in the bluest expression, even so. As moons worked through their staggered shapes, as the quick came down through the ebbing dead, free of definite reference, one repaired to other habitats, one left concentric rings. Far out, part of the hours misting plants, part of the light, part of the prismatic marvel fern tips make at a north-looking window, part of the parting of bodies from souls, part of the hours brushing down, brushing against these other beings, laughing with, singing to, leading to grass, part of the next, if not now, nearing the irreplaceable, passing in and out of boxed and circled particulars, dusting its legs and wings in apple flower, talking through and beyond a barred life that was always and never perfectly its own. How far out or inside it is as it tracks the leaps of blue flame, as it touches the cold campfire and asks the wind not to erase. Ringed invisibly with age, that much farther drawn than chemistry to salt, part of the air, part of the hours that won't be caught or tabled, what swam inadvisably far and out, what shook in the glister of toppling waves.
And those are all new poems and part of this new book. That's great. Is that finished, more or less?
Yes, it's finished. It's looking for a home, which it may or may not find. I don't know. It's out looking for a home. I'll put it that way.
I remember when I saw this addressee poem online somewhere, and I love that line. I worry less that I'm not into this. I love the curtain between us. You have a lot of poems that do use direct address, you know, that find some you out there and speak to that you. You know, and I think there's a reading of this poem as, you know, where the you is the holy or the divine in a relatively straightforward devotional way. And other poems, it seems more complicated. You know, the you is maybe the speaker talking to themselves. What was it like to write, or, you know, if I'm right about this poem, or if you feel like you do have poems that are devotional, you know, what's it like to write in that kind of really intentional mode?
You intentional in terms of the I, thou?
Yeah, and maybe, you know, maybe it's not that you're sitting down and saying, I'm going to write in this way, but the poem turns into that at some point.
Yeah, I think, well, I've just very recently finished a paper on the Sufi mystic poet Ibn Arabi, who inherited the tradition of erotic poetry and turned it in the direction of the divine, so that the beloved in the Translator of Desires, which is the collection of his poems that I was writing about, the beloved is always one campsite away and is seen receding on the horizon. And just as you catch up to where they've just decamped from the place from which they've just decamped, the fire is, you know, the coals are maybe still warm, but the beloved has moved on. and part of the translation project is to look for the signs of the beloved that seem to still bear that heat or that fire or that energy, and that sustain your pursuit. And so I guess that makes a lot of sense to me, that I think, going back to my beginning in poetry, Dylan Thomas, I forget which poem, it might be especially, I'm not sure which poem it is, but he says, "Some let me make you of the voweled beaches." And so his engagement of the you there seems to be a kind of audience that for whom he is trying to bring across what these beech trees mean to him. But they're voweled beaches. I don't know what that means, but that he wants to, I don't know, round them out or sound them out for his audience. And so I think that is a kind of work ethic that appeals to me. Some let me make you. It's a kind of antique phrasing. Some let me make you of the voweled beaches. I want to give this to you. So there's that kind of you, which is I'm making on behalf of an audience. And maybe that phrase making for, I've thought about this a little bit, that the phrase making for, we use that in a navigational sense. So I'm making for that lighthouse over there, or I'm making for that mountain, or whatever it might be that we're aiming towards. But then there's the making for that is the kind of dedicatory making for. And I think the making for in the navigational sense, that you would be the divine for me, with the understanding that it's a distance that you don't ever close.
Yeah.
And I think I guess I would just say I'm very, what I've learned in the past 2 years of doing this formal study is I'm very attached to curing myself of the habit of addressing God as a male being, or as any kind of gendered being, or I even at this point find it hard to use the word God. I think I prefer source of being, but then you get the acronym SOB, which is not a good acronym. But I guess that you feels kind of ambiguous and capacious enough to accommodate a kind of, in the technical term, aseity or otherness that is beyond, kind of delineating or creating a contour for, and certainly for me, beyond gender.
Yeah. Well, and maybe this is why we write poem after poem, that risks that kind of address, because in each case the you is, different, right? It establishes different facets or something. Like Alan Grossman says something about analogy, religious analogy, in the same way. Like, that's the reason why God is compared to all of these different things in the Hebrew Bible, because it's saying, okay, yeah, God is like this, but also God is not this, God is not that, God is not that. And so it's a devotional practice in that way. We're getting close to the hour, and I wonder if anybody else wanted to jump in. If not, that's totally okay. I have at least one more question for Sarah, but does anybody else want to add your voice? Sarah, maybe I'll just go ahead and ask my question, and then we can go from there. But so I'm curious about your work as a chaplain, and particularly how that might relate to poetry, and questions. I remember having this really cool moment in divinity school where I read that passage from John Keats about negative capability, and I realized that ability, which he says is so important to poets, so Shakespeare had. That's really what I wanted. That ability to be in uncertainty. That's really what I wanted to bring to the pastoral encounter. The moment when you walk into a hospital room or you visit someone, and just how hard that is, but the way that conversations can flow from that approach. And yeah, I'm wondering what kind of overlaps you're seeing between chaplaincy and pastoral care and poetry.
Yeah, well, I've had the good fortune to be volunteering for the past 2 years while I'm doing these studies at a men's shelter where they have a voice, or a group called Finding Voice. And a lot of the men have struggled with addiction and are recovering. And I think I've learned a lot about poetry as a therapeutic. I'm resisting saying tool, so I'm thinking of another word as a therapeutic process, as a therapeutic practice, and as a way of being with each other, and as a form of mutuality. I think that's something I love that the Jesuits stress, that when you're doing volunteer work, you're building relationship. That's the training that they give you, is that it's a form of mutual relationship. And I think one thing that really relieved me about pursuing clinical pastoral education and moving into those hospital contexts is something my program director said, which is that it's a ministry of presence. And I think this might be a specialized version of a ministry of presence, but I think we're all called to a ministry of presence, whether we're faithful, whether we're atheist, I think a ministry of presence means being ethical and responsible to one another. And I think it can be practiced in the smallest and the largest ways, and in the most practical, and also in sort of more theoretical ways too. But that was really relieving to me, because I think I had anxieties about not being clearly defined as I grew up Episcopalian. I moved towards Friends meetings and Quaker forms of meeting, but I find it very hard to define how to show up as a chaplain. And I was reassured by chaplains I've met with that what is more dangerous is people who go into this work with the aim of proselytizing and converting people who are essentially a captive audience. So that's certainly not my aim, but to have a term for this, like this ministry of presence, and to be someone who can remain calm and help people find their own questions, and help people feel really listened to in those really difficult, miserable moments, is something I think is a tremendous privilege if you can do it. And and I think poetry is a form of listening. I had a wonderful poetry teacher, Patricia Gotica, she was a really tiny person and just a bundle of energy. And she used to jump up and down, shouting at the class, "You have to listen to the poem being made." And I've never forgotten that. And when you're making a poem, what does that mean to listen to the poem being made? And I feel like I'm still learning what that means, but I think it's a practice that definitely carries over into whatever form of being present to other people in our lives is essentially about listening.
Totally. Just quickly, Sarah, a question came in from Shadow Wolf. How do you find time to write poetry and academic writing? Do you feel like it takes a bit to switch modes when you go from one to another?
That's a great question. Yeah. Poetry is the easier practice for me. I have a magpie sensibility, which doesn't necessarily lend itself to writing academic papers and writing scholarly arguments. It's, I kind of want to talk about everything, and I resist that argument that, leads to one conclusion. And luckily I've had teachers who've been sympathetic with that. But I think I've developed just tremendous respect for scholars who know how to metabolize research and assess it fairly, and still kind of find their own voice on the other side of that research, because I feel like I've never grown out of this sort of book report mode where I can report on what people are saying, but I find it very hard to then sort of push my own argument. And maybe that's because as a poet, I'm more interested in the questions than the answers. But I think it's a great skill to practice. And I love doing research. I seem to resist synthesis.
No, I'm with you in that regard, but glad there are others who have those gifts for really digging in. This has been so great. We should wrap up. Sarah, thank you so much for your poems and what you had to say about them. And really great to see everybody on the Zoom. Thanks so much for being with us. Lydia, do you want to say anything to sign us off?
Sure, I will. Yeah, thank you so much, Sarah and Nate, to you both. This has been a fantastic hour together, much needed. Just wonderful to hear more about your work. So thank you all again to everyone for joining us. Hope to see you in the next one. Take care.
Thank you so much for coming.
Bye, everybody. Thanks.